So I am going to take a bit of a step back from where we've been in the sessions this morning and look at the broader data environment. So we know significant benefit can come from big data innovation. And a lot of what I'm going to discuss today, I guess I'm just going to say straight up front, we think that good data practices does not prohibit good innovation. We're very supportive of a lot of the things that can be done with data to compare products and services, to provide consumers with better advice. What we're going to talk about today is how you design good data practices to enable that good innovation. So from our perspective, we've been involved in the Consumer Data Right for the last 18 months. We sit on the Data Standards Body Advisory Council. We've also been involved in the Digital Platforms Inquiry by the ACCC and also the Data Sharing and Release Act. Our research has focused on consumer preferences when it comes to data, some of the emerging risks and benefits that we've seen internationally, and some of the key questions for policymakers. So data is going to be the fuel of the fourth industrial revolution. Neither technology or data is good or bad. It's kind of about what you do with it and what the governance around those things looks like. The key issues we've been exploring at CPRC is how data should be governed, what are consumer and community expectations when it comes to data, how do we ensure consumers experience transparency and agency, and how is the value of data shared between consumers and industry. And so just panning back to see the broader data ecosystem is quite important because data isn't just going to be ported within one sector. When we think about energy data, it will be the case that energy data will be combined with other data sets outside of energy as well. And so when we're designing a governance framework for consumer data, we need to be thinking about these cross-sectoral amalgamation issues. And I mean, some of the data sets we've been looking at through our research include things like obviously the digital platforms data sets, the data brokers and data amalgamation that's going on out in the broader environment, loyalty programs, and also public data sets. So all of these things start to, and this is not obviously exhaustive, but just to give you a picture of energy sits within this broader data ecosystem. And when we think about designing policy instruments, we need to be very conscious of that. So I just want to share a few words of wisdom and a bit of a spoiler, they're not mine. There are other people who have been turning their minds to these problems, and we've seen that happen across a bunch of different disciplines and sectors and jurisdictions. So Yuval Noah Harari, if anyone's read the Sapiens series, his most recent book is 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, really called this out as a key issue we need to grapple with this century. It comes down to who owns the data and how the data is valued and how that value is shared. It's also something that was reflected in Rod Sims' comments in relation to the digital platform, the way we govern data. Oh no, it skipped forward. What's going on, tech team? Okay, that's Yuval. Okay, so Yuval said, so we had better call upon our lawyers, politicians, philosophers, and even poets to turn their attention to this conundrum. How do you regulate the ownership of data? This may be the most important political question of our era. These are really big challenges. They are complex, and I think that at the moment, no one's got a particularly clean and good solution, but it's an very exciting time to be involved in public policy as a result. What we've seen is also international leaders starting to raise concerns about privacy. So this is the Microsoft CEO at the recent Davos World Economic Forum who said, "My own point of view is that it's a fantastic start in treating privacy as a human right. I hope that in the United States we do something similar and that the world converges on a common standard." So increasingly we're seeing privacy and data protection issues being fundamental to trust and effective competition. It keeps skipping. Sadia also said at the Davos Forum in January that the default should be that consumers own their own data. And so the way we think about designing policy instruments within this climate really does increasingly highlight the intersection between competition, consumer protection, and privacy regulation. So we're not alone in grappling with these issues, as I've just touched on. Internationally, what we're seeing is that real intersection, and we've seen it reflected in the ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry as well. So the keys to consumer choice and agency often lie within the privacy framework and the data protection framework of the jurisdiction. So that relates to the disclosure obligations relating to how data is used, who it's shared with, and what it's being used for. What the right of recourse is when things go wrong, and that's where we start to hear things like the right to delete or the right to erase. And also minimum protections for vulnerable groups who may be particularly at risk of certain interventions and targeting. We're also seeing broad-scale recognition of market power issues associated with very large volumes of data being amalgamated without express voluntary consent of consumers. So the Bundeskartellamt, the German competition regulator, I think it was this month, has proposed significant restrictions on the extent to which Facebook can amalgamate data without express consent. They found that the terms and conditions for Facebook were not justified within data protection or competition standards. So this growing recognition of the interplay between very large companies that are able to amalgamate very large amounts of data without express consent is very much becoming a forefront issue for competition and consumer protection regulators. And also in terms of the lack of disclosure, comes down to actually a quality issue with the product as it relates to privacy. My friend Ben will be talking about this tomorrow, I should say colleague as well. He'll be talking about the lack of disclosure around service quality information impeding competition and the benefits of greater transparency. What I also just thought I'd touch on is that globally, I guess what we've seen is quite significant processes leading up to things like the GDPR. So Europe started working on these issues in 2011. It just gives you a bit of kind of a time frame for how long they've been thinking about personal data and information and the governance required around that. We haven't really had the same level of robust policy discussion about a governance framework in Australia. We've seen a little bit more of a piecemeal approach, generally speaking. So the current data policy environment in Australia, I've just tried to pull a quick summary together of the processes we've been involved with just to highlight to people the differing processes and what they deal with. So the Consumer Data Right is dealing with consumer data, obviously in banking first, then energy and telecommunications. I don't know why this keeps doing this. It's kind of... The ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry is looking at the data collection, sharing, amalgamation and use of digital platforms. And the data sharing release legislation is looking at public data and sharing between agencies. Oh, is it? You're probably right. Should I move over here? All right, so key policy issues. Can I just say slide? Can you manually do? Yeah, okay. So key policy issues in the Consumer Data Right is about voluntary data portability. It is the consumer controlling their own data in a voluntary manner to share that with another party. It does not deal with the governance of the broader data ecosystem that we're currently dealing with. The ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry deals to market power issues, information asymmetries and lack of choice. The ACCC found significant market and regulatory failure in Australia's privacy regime, which has been preventing consumers from making informed choices. And they've recommended major reform of the Privacy Act to increase transparency. And they've also, in their preliminary recommendations, had a look at default settings and setting those to off as a standard, not to on. In the data sharing and release legislation that's dealing with public data sets, it's looking at public investment, research, but also improvements to government processes. And I guess what we point out is that when we look at these processes from a consumer's point of view, the things we're very interested in are things like consent, which relates very closely to transparency, and control and deletion, which relates to agency. And so that third line there is kind of looking at the different ways those processes are dealing with consent. So Consumer Data Right, obviously, as Daniel pointed out, deals with consent through the privacy safeguards and is a deviation from the Privacy Act and APPs, Australian Privacy Principles. The Digital Platforms Inquiry, as I said, has recommended major changes to the Privacy Act as it relates to disclosure and consent. And the data sharing and release legislation actually proposes to remove the areas around consent because it is dealing with data sharing between government agencies and dealing with public sector data. The fourth line there around control and deletion is really where we're saying differences in different rights for different reasons. So consumer data right allows the data at the moment to be withdrawn but not deleted. The Digital Platforms Inquiry is currently recommending in their preliminary recommendations that there is a deletion right explicitly recommended within privacy legislation. And again, within the data sharing release legislation, we don't have that explicit right. So it's just to highlight these different processes and the fact, I guess, from our perspective, we see great benefit in there being a far more joined up approach to policy issues in Australia. So I'm just going to run through some of the key issues. Sorry, slide. And again, I'm going to rush through this. So when we think about this and talk to regulators, the key things we're thinking about is transparency and pursuing an agenda of transparency. So regulators can't regulate what we collectively as a policy community don't yet fully understand. The second reason we focus on transparency is because consumers can't act on what they don't understand. Slide. Our research completed last year found a great disempowerment and frustration associated with consumer data and privacy policies. I'm not going to go through all of those slides, but I'm happy to talk about them in the next chat. And we certainly agree with the ACCC recommendations associated with reform of the Privacy Act. Consent, in our view, needs to be express, it needs to be voluntary, specific to purpose, it needs to be time-bound, easy to understand and access and able to be withdrawn. Slide. And again. In terms of ethics, the things we've been thinking about are ethics at the point of design and ethics at the point of use. When you think about ethics at design, you're talking about privacy by design principles, generally in technology and regulation. When you're talking about at use, often what we're starting to see are things like the Bill of Rights of Nudging, which was developed by Cass Sunstein, one of the grandfathers of behavioural economics last year. Cass developed these 5 principles for ethical nudging, and when we think about nudging, I'll give you a very basic one. Defaults is the most classic form of nudging, setting default settings. The 5 things Cass has recommended in that is that they should be consistent with values and interests of the community, they should be for legitimate ends, but the last one I'll just highlight is that they shouldn't take things without people's consent. So we can talk about that a bit later. And maybe just to the last slide. These are some of the things, These are some of the things that we're working through at the moment with policymakers. So improving transparency and building trust, empowering consumers, increasing comprehension, protecting fundamental rights, and dealing with data ownership. I'm going to stop there because I'm getting a big red stop sign. Thank you.